Burn the crops, get married. The price of coffee dictates all. What's this? An electroencephalogram of a lunatic? In 1889, coffee was worth 2 cents, and 6 years later it had risen to 9. 3 years later it was down to 4. 5 years after that to 2. A typical period. A graph of coffee prices, like those of all tropical products, has always resembled a clinical epilepsy chart, more than ever when it shows the value of coffee in exchange for machinery and industrial products. Colombian President Yves Restrepo complained that in 1967 his country had to pay 57 sacks of coffee for a Jeep that had only cost 17 sacks in 1950. Figures offered at the same time by Brazilian Minister of Agriculture Herbert Levy were more dramatic. For a tractor which had cost 70 sacks of coffee 14 years earlier, Brazil now had to pay 350 sacks. When President Gutilio Vargas put a bullet through his heart in 1954, the price of coffee played a role in the tragedy. The crisis in coffee production came, he wrote in his moving final testament, and the price of our chief product went up. We tried to defend the price, and the answer was such violent pressure on our economy that we had to give in. Vargas hoped that his blood would buy salvation for the Brazilian people. If the 1964 coffee crop had been sold on the US market at 1955 prices, Brazil would have received 200 million more. A drop of only 1 cent in the price meant a loss of 65 million to the combined producing countries. With the price falling continually between 1964 and 1968, the consuming country, the United States, helped itself to more and more millions from the producing company, Brazil. Producing country, Brazil. But for the benefit of whom? Of the coffee drinking citizen? In July 1968, Brazilian coffee cost 30% less in the United States than in January 1964, but US consumers did not pay less. They paid 13% more. Thus, in the 1964-1968 period, middlemen kept the 13% as well as the 30%, feathering their nests twice over. In the same period, the price Brazilian producers received for each sack of coffee dropped by half. Who are the middlemen? 6 US concerns control more than a third of the coffee that leaves Brazil. Another 6 control more than a third of what enters the United States. These firms dominate the business at both ends. Just as United Fruit monopolizes the sale of bananas from Central America, Colombia, and Ecuador, as well as their importation and distribution in the United States, so US firms run the coffee business, and Brazil only participates as supplier and victim. The Brazilian state takes over the stocks when overproduction demands the accumulation of reserves. But isn't there an international coffee agreement to stabilize prices on the market? The World Coffee Information Center published a detailed document in Washington in 1970 to try and convince legislators that the United States should keep the agreement in force after September. The report affirms that the agreement's chief beneficiary has been the United States, which consumes more than half the coffee sold in the world. The purchaser of the coffee beans always gets a bargain. In the US market, the trivial rise in price for the middleman's benefit, as we have seen, has been much less than the general rise of living costs and internal wage levels. U.S. exports rose in value by 1/6 between 1960 and 1969, and in the same period, the value of coffee imports dropped. And one must bear in mind that Latin American countries use depreciated foreign currency from coffee sales to buy ever costlier U.S. products. It is much more profitable to consume coffee than to produce it. In the United States and Europe, coffee creates income and jobs and mobilizes substantial capital. In Latin America, it pays hunger wages and sharpens economic deformation. It provides work for more than 600,000 people in the United States. Those who distribute and sell Latin American coffee there earn infinitely more than the Brazilians, Colombians, Guatemalans, Salvadorians, and Haitians who plant and harvest it on the plantations. And incredible as it seems, coffee, so ECLA tells us, puts more wealth into European state coffers than it leaves in the hands of the producing countries. In effect, 1960 and 1961, the total taxes levied on Latin American coffee by European Economic Community countries amounted to about 700 million, while supplier countries, in terms of the FOB value of exports, only got 600 million. The rich countries that preach free trade apply stern protectionist policies against the poor countries. They turn everything they touch, including the underdeveloped country's own production, into gold for themselves and rubbish for others. The international coffee market operates so exactly like a funnel that Brazil recently agreed to impose high taxes on its soluble coffee exports. Reverse protectionism designed to protect the interests of competing U.S. manufacturers. Instant coffee made in Brazil is cheaper and better than that made by the flourishing U.S. industry. But then, of course, in a system of free competition, some are freer than others. In this kingdom of organized absurdity, natural disasters become blessings from heaven for the producing countries. They raise prices and permit the mobilization of accumulated reserves. Fierce frost wrecked the 1969 harvest in Brazil and sealed the fate of many producers, especially the weakest, but at the same time pushed up coffee prices on the world market and appreciably lightened the stock of 60 million sacks, the equivalent of 2/3 of Brazil's external debt, which the state had accumulated to defend prices. The warehouse coffee, progressively deteriorating and losing value, could have ended up in a bonfire. It would not have been the first time. The collapse of prices and the shrinkage in consumption after the 1929 crisis caused Brazil to burn 78 million sacks. Thus, the efforts of 200,000 people during 5 harvests went up in flames. This was a typical crisis in a colonial economy. It came from outside. Apart from burning the coffee, the fall of the planters and exporters' profits in the 1930s produced a bonfire in currency values. Such is the normal Latin American mechanism to socialize the losses of the export sector. Losses of foreign currency are compensated in national currency through devaluation. The consequences of rising prices are no better. While they lead to more sowing for more production and multiply the area devoted to the fortunate crop, this acts as a boomerang, since an abundance of the product demolishes prices and leads to disaster. Such was the fate of Colombia in 1958 when it harvested the coffee sown so enthusiastically 4 years earlier, and similar cycles have recurred throughout that country's history. Colombia is so dependent on coffee and its external price that in Antioquia the marriage curve responds sensitively to the coffee price curve, par for the course in a dependent structure. Even the propitious moment for a declaration of love on an Antiochian hillside is decided on the New York Stock Exchange. The 10 years that emptied Colombia's veins. Back in the 1940s, the noted Colombian economist Luis Eduardo Nieto Arteta wrote an apologia for coffee. Coffee had achieved what neither mines nor tobacco nor indigo nor quinine had managed to produce in the country's previous economic cycles. It had given birth to a mature and progressive order. Textile factories and other light industries had arisen in coffee producing areas. Antioquia, Caldas, Valle del Cauca, Cundinamarca, and not by accident. The democracy made up of small farmers raising coffee had turned Colombians into moderate and sober people. The strongest premise for normality in the functioning of Colombian political life has been the attainment of our own kind of economic stability. Coffee has produced it, and with it, tranquility and moderation. Violence soon erupted again, for all the panegyrics. Coffee had no magic with which to end Colombia's long history of revolt and bloody repression. This time, for 10 years, from 1948 to 1957, small and large plantations, desert and farmland, valley and forest, and Andean plateau were engulfed in peasant war. It put whole communities to flight, generated revolutionary guerrillas and criminal bands, and turned the country into a cemetery. It is estimated to have left a total of 180,000 dead. The bloodbath coincided with a period of economic euphoria for the ruling class. But is the prosperity of a class really identifiable with the well-being of a country? The violence began with the confrontation between liberal and conservative parties. The dynamic of class hostilities steadily sharpened its class struggle character. The liberal leader, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, known half contemptuously and half fearfully to his own party's oligarchy as the wolf or the idiot, had won great popular prestige and threatened the established order. When he was shot dead, the hurricane was unleashed. First, the spontaneous bogotazo and uncontrollable human tide in the streets of the capital. Then the violence spread to the countryside, where bands organized by the conservatives have for some time been sowing terror. The bitter taste of hatred, long in the peasant's mouth, provoked an explosion. The government sent police and soldiers to cut off testicles, slash pregnant women's bellies, and throw babies in the air to catch on bayonet points. The order of the day being, don't leave even the seed. Liberal party sages shut themselves in their homes, never abandoning their good manners and the gentlemanly tone of their manifestos, or went into exile abroad. It was a war of incredible cruelty, and it became worse as it went on. Feeding the lust for vengeance, new ways of killing came into vogue. The corte corbata, for example, left the tongue hanging from the neck. Rape, arson, and plunder went on and on. People were quartered or burned alive, skinned or slowly cut in pieces. Troops razed villages and plantations, and rivers ran red with blood. Bandits spared lives in exchange for tribute in money or loads of coffee, and the repressive forces expelled and pursued innumerable families who fled to seek refuge in the mountains. Women gave birth in the woods. The first guerrilla leaders, determined to take revenge but without clear political vision, took to destroying for destruction's sake, letting off blood and steam without purpose. The names adopted by the protagonists of violence, Gorilla, Evil Shadow, the Condor, Redskin, the Vampire, Blackbird, Terror of the Plains, hardly suggest a revolutionary epic, yet the scent of social rebellion was in the couplets sung by their followers. I'm just a campesino. I didn't start the fight, but if they come asking for trouble, they get what's coming to them. There is no doubt that indiscriminate terror mixed with the cry for justice had emerged in the Mexican Revolution. In Colombia, many just ran amok, yet that violent decade gave birth to the political guerrillas who later raised the banner of social revolution over broad areas they came to occupy and control. Hounded by the repressed peasants, took to the mountains to organize agriculture and self-defense. So-called independent republics continued to offer refuge to the persecuted after conservatives and liberals signed a peace pact in Madrid. In an abeyance of toasts, in an ambiance of toasts and mutual goodwill, the leaders of both parties agreed to take turns in power under a banner of national unity, and then began the cleanup operations against Fossey of subversion. In one of these operations alone, the crushing of the rebels in Marquetalia, 1.5 million projectiles were fired, 20,000 bombs were dropped, and 16,000 soldiers were mobilized on the ground and in the air. At the height of the violence, one official said, "Don't bring me stories, bring me ears." Could the sadism of the repression and the ferocity of the war be explained clinically? Were they the result of inherent evil in the protagonists? A man who cut off the hands of a priest, set fire to his body and his house, and later cut him in pieces and threw him in a sewer, cried after the war was over, "I am not guilty, leave me alone." He had lost, yet in certain sense retained his reason. The horror of all the violence merely exposed the horror of the system, for coffee did not bring happiness and harmony as Nieto Arteta had prophesied. It is true that coffee opens up railroads, highways, and the Rio Magdalena to navigation, and that thanks to coffee enough capital was accumulated to found some industries, but the ascendancy of coffee did not affect either the oligarchical social order or the dependence of the economy on foreign power centers. On the contrary, both became far more oppressive for Colombians. Toward the end of the violent decade, the United Nations published the results of a study of nutrition in Colombia, and there has been absolutely no improvement since then. 88% of Bogota schoolchildren suffered from avidominosis, 78% from riboflavinosis, and more than half were below normal weight. Avidominosis affected 71% of workers and 78% of Tensa Valley peasants. The study showed a marked insufficiency of protective foods, milk and its derivatives, eggs, meat, fish, and some fruits and vegetables, which together provide protein, vitamins, and salt. It is not only the flash of gunfire that reveals social tragedy. Statistics show that Colombia has 7 times more homicides than the United States, and that 1 in every 4 Colombians of active age has no regular job. Every year, 250,000 people come onto the labor market while industry fails to generate new jobs. Latifundio, minifundio system not only cannot absorb more labor, but it constantly banishes more people to swell the ranks of the unemployed in city slums. In Colombia, over 1 million children do not attend school. This does not discourage the system from running 41 public and private universities, each with its own faculties and departments, to educate the children of the elite and middle class. The world market casts its spell over Central America. Central America lands were comparatively unmolested up until the middle of the past century. In addition to food, the area produced cochineal and indigo with modest capital, a meager labor force, and few worries. Both the indigo plant and the cochineal bug, busily multiplying on the prickly surface of the nopal cactus, were in steady demand in European textile industries. But both of these natural pigments met a synthetic death around 1850 when German chemists invented aniline and other cheaper dyes. 30 years after this victory of the laboratory over nature, it was coffee's turn. Central America was transformed. By 1880, its newborn plantations were raising almost 1/6 of the world's coffee production. Coffee locked the region firmly into the world market. First English, then German, and finally U.S. buyers gave life to a native coffee bourgeois, which became the political power after the revolution led by Justo Rufino Barrios early in the 1870s. Agricultural specialization dictated from abroad set off a frenzy of land and labor grabbing. Central American latifundio of today was born under the banner of free labor. Great tracts of idle land belonging to no one, or to the church, or to the state, passed into private hands. Indian communities were frenetically plundered. Peasants who declined to sell their land were hauled off into the army. Plantations became human compost pits for Indians. The colonial order was revived with the forcible recruitment of labor and with laws against vagrancy, while fugitive workers were pursued with guns. Liberal governments modernized labor relations by introducing wages, but recipients of the wages became the property of upstart coffee planters. At no time in the ensuing century, of course, were periods of high prices reflected in wages, which have remained at the hunger level no matter how much was paid for the coffee. This helped prevent the development of any internal consumer market in Central America. As elsewhere, the ever-expanding cultivation of coffee discouraged food raising for the home market. These countries, too, were condemned to a chronic scarcity of rice, beans, corn, wheat, tobacco, and meat. A bleak subsistence agriculture barely survived on the high, semi-barren lands to which the latifundio drove the Indians when it appropriated the lower and more fertile areas. The Indians who work on the plantations at harvest time spend part of the year on tiny mountain plots raising the corn and beans without which they could not survive. They are the world market's labor reserve. Nothing has changed in a century. Latifundio and minifundio together make up a system based on ruthless exploitation of Indian labor in general, but especially in Guatemala. The structure of labor force appropriation is visibly identified with racism. Indians suffer the internal colonialism of whites and mestizos, blessed ideologically by the dominant culture, just as Central American countries suffer foreign colonialism. Early in our century, banana enclaves made their appearance in Honduras, Guatemala, and Costa Rica. A few railway lines financed by native capital have been built to take coffee to the ports. U.S. concerns took over these railroads and built others to carry the products of their own plantations exclusively, while monopolizing electric light, the mails, telegraph, and telephone, and no less important public service politics. In Honduras, a mule costs more than a deputy. and throughout Central America, U.S. ambassadors do more presiding than presidents. The United Fruit Company swallowed up its competitors in the production and sale of bananas and became Central America's top latifundista, while its affiliates cornered rail and sea transport. It took over the ports and set up its own customs and police. The dollar, in effect, became the national currency of Central America. The filibusters come aboard. In the geopolitical concept of imperialism, Central America is no more than a natural appendage of the United States. Not even Abraham Lincoln, who also contemplated annexation, could resist the manifest destiny of the great power to dictate to its contiguous areas. In the middle of the 19th century, the filibuster William Walker, operating on behalf of bankers Morgan and Garrison, invaded Central America at the head of a band of assassins. With the obliging support of the U.S. government, Walker robbed, killed, burned, and in successive expeditions proclaimed himself president of Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. He restored slavery in the areas that suffered his devastating occupation, thus continuing his country's philanthropic work in the states that had just been seized from Mexico. He was welcomed back to the United States as a national hero. From then on, invasions, interventions, bombardments, forced loans, and gunpoint treaties followed one after the other. In 1912, President William H. Taft declared, "The day is not far distant when 3 stars and stripes at 3 equidistant points will mark our territory, one at the North Pole, another at the Panama Canal, and a third at the South Pole. The whole hemisphere will be ours, in fact, as by virtue of our superiority of race, it already is ours morally." End quote. Taft said that the correct path of justice in U.S. foreign policy may well be made to include active intervention to secure for our merchandise and our capitalists opportunity for profitable investment. In the same period, ex-President Theodore Roosevelt loudly recalled his successful amputation of land from Colombia. "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate," said the proud Nobel Peace Prize winner as he related how he had invented Panama. Colombia soon afterward received $25 million in indemnity. It was the price of a country that was born so that the United States could have a route between the two oceans. U.S. concerns took over lands, customs, houses, treasuries, and governments. Marines landed here, there, and everywhere to protect the lives and interests of U.S. citizens. The same holy water formula that would be used to deodorize the Dominican Republic crime in 1965. General Smedley D. Butler, who headed many of the expeditions, indicated the sort of merchandise that was wrapped inside the flag when he wrote in 1935 his own experience. "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active service as a member of our country's most agile military force, the Marine Corps. I served in all commissioned ranks from second lieutenant to major general, and during that period I spent most of my time being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Thus I helped make Mexico and especially Tampico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank to collect revenues in. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers in 1909 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for American fruit companies in 1903. In the first years of our century, with the philosopher William James passed the little-known judgment that the country had finally vomited the Declaration of Independence. To cite but one example, the United States occupied Haiti for 20 years, and in that black country that had been the scene of the first victorious slave revolt, introduced racial segregation and forced labor, killed 1,500 workers in one of its repressive operations, according to U.S. Senate investigation 1922, and when the local government refused to turn the Banco Nacional into a branch of New York's National City Bank, suspended the salaries of the president and his ministers so that they might think again, alternating the big stick with dollar diplomacy. Similar actions were carried out in the other Caribbean islands and in all of Central America, the geopolitical space of the imperial Mare Nostrum. The Quran mentions the banana among the trees of paradise, but the bananization of Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Ecuador suggests that it is a tree of hell. United Fruit became owner of the biggest latifundio in Colombia when a big strike broke out on the Atlantic coast in 1928. Banana workers were mowed down with bullets in front of a railroad station. The forces of public order are authorized to punish with the aid of appropriate weapons. It was officially decreed, and no further decree was necessary to wipe the massacre from official memory. Miguel Angel Asturias described the process of Central American conquest and plunder in his novel The Green Pope, about Minor Keith, uncrowned king of the region, great white father of United Fruit, devourer of nations. We have docks, railroads, land, buildings, and water. The dollar circulates, English is spoken, and they fly our flag. Chicago could not help but feel proud of that son who went off with a brace of pistols and returned to demand his position among the meat emperors, the railroad kings, the copper kings, the chewing gum kings. William James, I think. In the 42nd parallel, John Dos Passos traced the dazzling career of Keith and United Fruit. In Europe and the United States, people had started to eat bananas, so they cut down the jungles through Central America to plant bananas and built railroads to haul the bananas, and every year more steamboats of the Great White Fleet steamed north loaded with bananas, and that is the history of the American Empire in the Caribbean and the Panama Canal and the future Nicaragua Canal and the Marines and the battleships and the bayonets. The land was as exhausted as the workers. The land was robbed of hummus and the workers of their lungs, but there were always new lands to exploit and new workers to exterminate. Comic opera dictators watched over United Fruit's interests with knives between their teeth. Banana production eventually fell, and the omnipotent corporation went through various crises. Although cotton and sugar have pushed the banana off its privileged perch, Central America remains to this day a bonanza sanctuary for adventurers. Bananas are still the main source of foreign currency for Honduras and Panama, and in South America for Ecuador. Around 1929, Central America exported 38 million bunches, and United Fruit paid Honduras a penny tax on each. There was no way to see that this mini tax, which later rose slightly, was actually paid, nor is there today for even now United Fruit exports and imports. what it likes, operating outside the state customs system. Exports and imports what it likes, operating outside the state customs system. The country's trade and payment balances are the works of fiction of exceptionally imaginative technicians. The crisis of the 1930s. Killing an ant is a greater crime than killing a man. Coffee depended on the U.S. market, on U.S. consumption capacity, and on U.S. prices. Bananas were a business of, by, and for the United States. Suddenly, in 1929 came the crisis. In the Caribbean, the New York stock market disaster, which cracked the foundations of world capitalism, fell like a huge block of stone into a puddle. Coffee and banana prices plummeted along with sales. Peasants were evicted on all sides. Unemployment soared, and a wave of strikes swept city and countryside. Credit, investment, and public spending collapsed. In Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua's state employers' salaries were cut almost in half. Jackbooted dictators were the order of the day. In Washington, it was the dawn of the good neighbor policy, but social agitation was boiling up everywhere and had to be sternly suppressed. For about 20 years, for some more, for some less, power would remain in the hands of Guatemala's Jorge Ubico Castaneda, El Salvador's Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez, Honduras' Tiburcio Carias Andino, and Nicaragua's Anastasio Somoza. The epic of Augusto Cesar Sandino stirred the world. The long struggle of Nicaragua's guerrilla leader was rooted in the angry peasants' demand for land. His small, ragged army fought for some years against 12,000 U.S. invaders and the National Guard. Sardine tins filled with stones served as grenades. Springfield rifles were stolen from the enemy, and there were plenty of machetes. The flag flew from any handy stick, and the peasants moved through mountain thickets wearing strips of hide called huaraches instead of boots. The guerrillas sang to the tune of Adelita. In Nicaragua, gentlemen, the mouse kills the cat. Neither the Marines' firepower nor the bombs dropped from flames sufficed to crush the rebels of Las Segovias, nor did the calumnies spread worldwide by Associated Press and United Press International, whose Nicaraguan correspondents were two North Americans who controlled the country's custom houses. In 1932, Sandino had a presentiment: I won't live very long. A year later, under the influence of the good neighbor policy, hostilities ceased. The guerrilla leader was invited by the president to a decisive meeting in Managua, and on the way was killed in ambush. The murderer, Anastasio Somoza, later said that U.S. Ambassador Arthur Bliss Lane had ordered the execution. Somoza, then head of the army, soon installed himself in power. He ruled Nicaragua for a quarter of a century and then bequeathed the job to his sons. Before wrapping the presidential sash across his breast, Somoza had conferred upon himself the Cross of Valor, the Medal of Distinction, and the Presidential Medal of Merit. Once in power, he organized various massacres and grand celebrations for which he dressed up his soldiers in sandals and helmets like Romans. He became the country's biggest coffee producer with 46 plantations and raised cattle on 51 additional haciendas, but he was never too busy to spread terror. During his long reign, he lacked for nothing, and even recalled with some wistfulness his youthful years when he had to forge gold coins to pay for his amusements. The crisis brought tensions to a head, too, in El Salvador. Nearly half of Honduras' banana workers were Salvadorians, and many had to return to their country where there was no work for anyone. A peasant rising in the Izalco region in 1932 quickly spread. A peasant rising in the Izalco region in 1932 quickly spread throughout western El Salvador. Hernandez sent troops with modern equipment to deal with the Bolsheviks. The Indians fought with machetes against machine guns, and the incident ended with 10,000 dead. Hernandez, a vegetarian crank and theosophist, maintained that killing an ant is a greater crime than killing a man, because a man is reincarnated after death while an ant dies once and for all. He said he was protected by invisible legions who reported all plots and were in direct telepathic communication with the President of the United States. A pendulum clock showed him if food on a dish placed beneath it was poisoned, or showed places on a map where pirate treasure or political enemies were hidden. He used to send condolence notes to the parents of his victims, and deer pastured in the patio of his palace. He ruled until 1944. Massacres were continual throughout the area. In Guatemala in 1933, Jorge Ubico shot 100 trade union student and political leaders while restoring the laws against Indian vagrancy. Each Indian had to carry a book listing his days of work. If these were deemed insufficient, he paid the debt in jail or by bending his back over the ground without pay for half a year. On the unhealthy Pacific coast, men worked up to their knees in mud for 30 cents a day, and United Fruit explained that Ubico had forced it to cut wages. Just before the dictator fell in 1944, Reader's Digest ran a eulogistic article about him. This harbinger of the International Monetary Fund had avoided inflation by lowering wages from $1 to 25 cents a day in the construction of the emergency military highway, and from $1 to 50 cents for jobs on the air base in the capital. Ubico granted coffee and banana concerns permission to kill. Plantation proprietors will be exempt from criminal responsibility. This decree, number 2795, was revived in 1967 during the democratic and representative government of Julio Cesar Mendez Montenegro. Like all the Caribbean tyrants, Ubico thought he was Napoleon. He surrounded himself with busts and portraits of the emperor who, he said, had the same profile. He believed in military discipline. He militarized post office employees, school children, and the symphony orchestra. Dressed in uniforms, the orchestra member played Ubico's selections with techniques and instruments decided by him for $9 a month. He felt that hospitals were for sissies, and patients who were poor as well as sick were put on the floors of corridors and passageways. Who started the violence in Guatemala? Ubico was swept off his pedestal in 1944 by a revolution of liberal hue led by some young officers and middle-class university people. Juan Jose Arevalo, elected to the presidency, instituted a vigorous education plan and a new labor code to protect rural and city workers. Trade unions sprang tip. United Fruit, the virtually untaxed and uncontrolled owner of vast lands and of the railroad and port, was no longer omnipotent on its domains. In his farewell speech in 1951, Arevalo disclosed that he had had to deal with 32 conspiracies financed by the firm. The administration of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman continued and extended the reforms. Highways in the new port of San Jose broke United Fruit's monopoly of transport and export. With national capital and without begging from any foreign banker, various projects were launched to lead the country to independence. An agrarian reform law aimed basically at developing a peasant capitalist economy and an agricultural capitalist economy in general was approved in 1952. By 1954, over 100,000 families had benefited, although the law only affected idle lands and paid expropriated owners and indemnity in bonds. But since United Fruit was using a mere 8% of its land, which extended from ocean to ocean, its unused lands began to be distributed to the peasants. A frenetic international propaganda campaign was launched. The Iron Curtain is falling over Guatemala, roared the radio, newspapers, and the bigwigs of the Organization of American States. Colonel Rodolfo Castillo Armas, a graduate of Fort Leavenworth military post, invaded his own country with troops trained from and equipped for the purpose by the United States and with support from U.S. piloted F-47 bombers. We had to get rid of a communist government which had taken over, Dwight D. Eisenhower said 9 years later, testifying before a Senate subcommittee on July 27, 1961. The U.S. ambassador to Honduras said that the liberating operation in 1954 had been worked out by a team which included himself and the ambassadors to Guatemala, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. Allen Dulles, then #1 man at the CIA, had cabled them his congratulations on a job well done. Dulles had previously been on United Fruit Board's board of director, and in a year after the invasion, his seat was occupied by another CIA man, Walter Bedell Smith. Allen's brother, John Foster Dulles, had shown burning impatience at the OAS conference that approved the military expedition against Guatemala. It so happened that the United Fruit contracts in the Ubico era had been drafted in his law office. Arbenz's fall started a conflagration in Guatemala which has never been extinguished. The same forces that bombed Guatemala City, Puerto Barrios, and the port of San Jose on the evening of June 18, 1954, are in power today. Foreign intervention was followed by a series of ferocious dictatorships, including the administration of Mendez, who lent democratic trappings to the tyranny. Arbenz's agrarian reform was blown to smithereens when Castillo Armas fulfilled his mission of returning the land to United Fruit and other expropriated landlords. Mendez promised agrarian reform but merely signed an authorization for landlords to carry guns and to use them. The worst year in the orgy of violence begun in 1954 was 1967. Thomas Melville, a U.S. Catholic priest expelled from Guatemala, told the National Catholic Reporter in January 1968 that in little more than a year, right-wing terrorist groups had murdered more than 2,800 intellectuals, students, trade union leaders, and peasants who were trying to combat the sicknesses of Guatemalan society. Melville based his figure on information in the press, but most of the corpses never earned any report at all. They report Indians of no known name or habitat whom the army included, sometimes only as numbers, in its communiques on its victories over subversion. Indiscriminate repression formed a part of the military search and destroy campaign against guerrilla movements. Under the newly adopted code, members of the security forces were not held responsible for homicides, and police and army communiques were accepted as full proof by the courts. Plantation owners and managers had the legal status of local authorities, with the right to carry arms and form punitive squads. The systemic butchery set no teletypes humming, no news-hungry reporters flew to Guatemala, nor was any reproving voice heard. The world turned its back while Guatemala underwent a long St. Bartholomew's night. All the men of the village of Cajon del Rio were exterminated. Those of Tituque had their intestines gouged out with knives. In Piedra Parada, they were flayed alive. In Agua Blanca de Ipala, they were burned alive after being shot in the legs. A rebellious peasant's head was stuck on a pole in the center of San Jorge's Plaza. In Cerro Gordo, the eyes of Yami Valaquez were filled with pins. The body of Ricardo Miranda, 38 holes in his head, and the head of Geraldo Silva were found beside the San Salvador Highway. In Los Mixcos, Ernesto Chinchilla's tongue was cut out. In Ojo de Agua, the Olivia Aldana brothers, blindfolded and with hands tied behind backs, were pumped full of bullets. The head of Jose Guzman was chopped into a mass of tiny pieces and scattered along the road. In San Lucas Zacatepeques, The wells yielded corpses instead of water. On the Miraflores plantation, the men greeted the dawn without hands or feet. Threats were followed by executions or by shots without warning through the back of the neck. In the cities, the doors of the doomed were marked with black crosses. Occupants were machine gunned as they emerged, their bodies thrown into ravines. The violence did not stop after that. It has been a way of life in Guatemala ever since the period of humiliation and fury begun in 1954. Corpses, although not quite so many, continued to turn up in rivers and on roadsides, their featureless faces too disfigured by torture to be identified. The slaughter that is greater but more hidden, the daily genocide of poverty, also continues. In 1968, another expelled priest, Father Blase Bonpain, reported on this sick society in the Washington Post. Of the 70,000 people who die each year in Guatemala, 30,000 are children. The infant mortality rate in Guatemala is 40 times higher than in the United States. It was the dispossessed of Latin America with spears and machetes really fought against Spanish power at the dawn of the 19th century. Independence did not reward them. It betrayed the hopes of those who had shed their blood. Peace came, and with it, a new era of daily misery. Landowners and businessmen increased their fortunes while poverty grew among the masses. The intrigues of Latin America's new masters grew, and the four viceroyalties of the Spanish Empire blew up and gave birth to many new nations, splinters of a might have been national unity. The nation, as the subcontinent's gentry concerned it, looked too much like a busy port inhabited by the mercantile and financial clientele of the British Empire, with latifundios and mines in the background. A legion of parasites who had received the War of Independence communiques while dancing minutes in the city saloons used British-made wine glasses to drink toasts of freedom of trade. The most pompous rebellion slogans of the European bourgeois came into fashion as our countries placed themselves at the service of English industrialists and French thinkers. But what sort of national bourgeois was ours, composed of landlords, big-wheelers, and dealers and speculators, frock-coated politicos, and intellectuals of borrowed cultures? Latin America quickly gave birth to bourgeois continuations, well varnished with liberalism, but there was no creative bourgeois in the European or U.S. style to accompany them, one which would undertake as its historical mission the development of a strong national capitalism. Bourgeoisies of our countries came into being as mere instruments of international capitalism, liberally oiled cogs in the global mechanism that bled the colonies and semi-colonies. These shop window bourgeois, moneylenders, and merchants who monopolized political power had no interest in developing local manufacturers, which died in the egg when free trade opened the doors to the avalanche of British merchandise. Nor were their associates, the landlords, interested in resolving the agrarian question, except to the extent that they could feather their own nests. The latifundio was consolidated on a foundation of plunder, economic, social, national frustration. A series of betrayals followed independence, and Latin America, split apart by its new frontiers, was doomed as before to monoculture independence. Agrarian reform was a demand from the beginning. In 1824, Simón Bolívar issued the Trujillo Decree, designed to protect the Indians and reorganize the land ownership system in Peru. Its legal provisions in no way limited the Peruvian oligarchy's privileges, which remained intact despite the liberators' good intentions, and the Indians were as exploited as they had been before. Earlier, Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos had been defeated in Mexico, and a century would pass before anything came of their demands for the emancipation of the dispossessed and the recovery of usurped lands. Down south, it was Jose Artigas who personified the agrarian revolution. This man, the victim of impassioned vilification by official historians, led the masses during the heroic years from 1811 to 1820 in the area now occupied by Uruguay and the Argentine provinces of Santa Fe, Corrientes, Entre Rios, Misiones, and Cordoba. He wanted to lay economic, social, and political foundations for a great fatherland within the frontiers of the old Rio de la Plata viceroyalty, and was the most important and clear-headed of the leaders who resisted the annihilating centralism of the port of Buenos Aires. He fought against Spanish and Portuguese, and his forces were finally crushed by a pincer movement from Rio de Janeiro and Buenos Aires, instruments of the British Empire, and by an oligarchy which, true to form, sold him out as soon as they saw the implications of his program of social demands. Patriots took up arms to follow Ortigas. They were mostly poor country people, rugged gauchos, Indians who rediscovered their dignity in the struggle, slaves who won freedom by joining the Independence Army. The Cowboys' revolution set the Pampas aflame. Buenos Aires' betrayal in leaving what is now Uruguay in the hands of Spanish power and the Portuguese troops produced a mass exodus to the north. A people in arms became a people in flight. Men and women, old people and children abandoned everything to form an endless caravan of horses and carts behind their leader. Ortigas called a halt on the Rio Uruguay and soon set up his government. By 1815, he controlled a large area from his purification camp in Pasandu. "What do you think I saw?" an English traveler reported. "His Excellency, the Senior Protector of half the New World, sitting on the head of an ox beside a bonfire on the muddy soil of his ranch, eating barbecue meat and drinking gin from a cow's horn." A dozen ragged officers surrounded him. Soldiers, aides de camp, and scouts rode in the gallop from all directions. Pacing, hands behind his back, Ortigas dictated the revolutionary decrees of his people's government. 2 secretaries, carbon paper didn't exist, took notes. Thus was born Latin America's first agrarian reform. It was applied for a year in the eastern province, today's Uruguay, and then, after the oligarchy opened the doors of Montevideo to General Licor, greeted him as a liberator, and conducted him beneath a canopy to a solemn honor, the invader, Te Deum, in the cathedral, smashed by a new Portuguese invasion. Ortigas had earlier levied a tariff which heavily taxed foreign merchandise that competed with domestic products, manufacturers, and crafts, which were substantially developed, lay within the leader's dominions. At the same time, he stopped the taxation on the importation of means of production which were needed for economic development, and fixed a trifling duty on such Latin American products as Paraguayan yerba mate and tobacco. The gravediggers of the Revolution were also to bury these tariff measures. The Agrarian Code of 1815, free land, free men, was the most advanced and glorious of the many constitutions the Uruguayans would have. Ortigas' code was no doubt influenced by the idea of Pedro Rodriguez de Campomanes and Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos in the reformist era of Charles III, but beyond question it was also a revolutionary response to the national need for economic recovery and social justice. It included expropriation and distribution of the lands of bad Europeans and worse Americans who immigrated because of the revolution and were never pardoned. Lands belonging to the revolution's enemies were expropriated without indemnity, and let it be recalled that these enemies owned the great majority of the latifundios. Children did not have to pay for the sins of their fathers. The code offered them the same as it offered poor patriots. Lands were distributed on the principle that the most unfortunate will be the most privileged. Indians, in Ortigas' view, had the chief right. The essence of this agrarian reform was to settle the rural poor on the land, making a peasant out of the gaucho who was accustomed to roving life in war and to clandestine activities and smuggling in peace. Subsequent La Plata Basin governments would mercilessly suppress the gaucho, forcing him to work as a peon on big estates, but Ortigas wanted to make him an owner of land. The rebel gauchos began to enjoy honest work, built ranches and corrals, and planted their first crops. Foreign intervention wiped it all out. The oligarchy reared its head and took vengeance. The validity of Artigas land distribution was legislatively repudiated. From 1820 till the end of the century, the poor patriots who had benefited from the agrarian reform were violently evicted. The only land they kept was enough to be buried in. The defeated Artigas had gone to Paraguay to die alone after a long exile of austerity and silence. The land titles he had issued were without value. Government attorney Bernardo Bustamante, for example, said that, quote, the worthlessness of the said documents was clear at first sight. Meanwhile, order restored, his government hastened to celebrate the first constitution of independent Uruguay, that fragment of the great fatherland Artigas had vainly fought to consolidate. The Code of 1815 contained special clauses to avoid the accumulation of land in a few hands. In our day, the Uruguayan countryside looks like a desert. 500 families monopolize half of all the land, and to crown their power, also control 3/4 of the capital invested in industry and banking. Agrarian reform projects pile up in the parliamentary cemetery while the countryside is depopulated. Unemployment proliferates, and the number of people occupying agriculture steadily dwindles from one dramatic census to another. The country makes its living from wool and meat, but its pastures contain fewer sheep and fewer cows than at the beginning of our century. The backwardness of production meat methods is reflected in the low yields from livestock, dependent for food on periodic rains and natural soil fertility, and from crop farming. Meat production per animal is not even half that of France or Germany, and the same applies to milk in comparison with New Zealand, Denmark, and Holland. Every sheep produces a kilogram less wool than in Australia. Per hectare, wheat yields are 3 times lower than in France, corn 7 times lower than in the United States. Big landowners send their profits abroad, spend their summers at Punta del Este, and do not reside at their latifundios even in winter, paying occasional visits in their own airplanes. When the Association Rural was formed a century ago, 2/3 of its members already made their homes in the capital. The extensive production left to nature and hungry peons causes them no headaches, and it certainly pays off. The rents and profits of cattle capitalists now amount to no less than 75 million a year. Despite low yields, profits stay up because of extremely low costs. A landscape without people, the biggest latifundios provide work for barely 2 people per 1,000 hectares, and then not for the whole year. The always available labor supply accumulates miserably in hut settlements beside the ranches. The Quacho folklore, the subject of paintings and poems, is a far cry from the peon who works the broad, hostile lands today. Instead of leather boots, he wears frayed sandals. Instead of a wide belt adorned with gold or silver, an ordinary belt, or merely a knotted cord. The producers of meat have lost the right to eat it. Rarely do the Creoles have access to the typical Creole roast, juicy tender meat turning golden over fire. Misleadingly rosy international statistics notwithstanding, the truth is that pasta and chicken innard stew, no source of protein, is the basic diet of the Uruguayan campesino. Just a century after the Artigas Land Code, Emiliano Zapata introduced far-reaching agrarian reform in his zone of revolutionary jurisdiction in southern Mexico. It was 5 years after the dictator Porfirio Diaz had celebrated with huge fiestas the centenary of the Grito de Dolores, the beginning of the Mexican War of Independence from Spain. The official Mexico of frock-coated gentlemen olympically ignored the real Mexico whose poverty fed their splendor. In this republic of outcasts, workers' wages had not risen by a centavo since the historic rising of the priest Miguel Hidalgo in 1810. In 1910, 800 odd latifundistas, many of them foreigners, owned almost all the national territory. They were urban princelings who lived in the capital or in Europe and very occasionally visited their estates, where they slept shielded by high, buttressed walls of dark stone. On the other side of the walls, the peons huddled in adobe hovels. A population of 15 million, 12 million depended on rural wages, almost all of which were paid at the hacienda company stores in astronomically priced beans, flour, and liquor. prison, barracks, and vestry shared the task of combating the natural defects of the Indians who, as a member of one illustrious family put it, were born weak, drunk, and thieving, with the worker tied by inherited debts or by legal contract. Slavery was the actual labor system on Yucatan henequen plantations, on the tobacco plantations of the Valle Nacional, on Chiapas and Tabasco timberland and fruit orchards, and on the rubber, coffee, sugarcane, tobacco, and fruit plantations of Veracruz, Oaxaca, and Morelos. In a fine report on his visit, John Kenneth Turner wrote that the United States has virtually reduced Diaz to political dependency, and by so doing has virtually transformed Mexico into a slave colony of the United States. U.S. capital made juicy profits directly or indirectly from its association with the dictatorship. The Americanization of Mexico, of which Wall Street boasts, wrote Turner, is being accomplished and accomplished with a vengeance. In 1845, the United States had annexed the Mexican territories of Texas and California, where it restored slavery in the name of civilization. Mexico also lost the present states of Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah, more than half the country. The stolen territory was equal in size to present-day Argentina. Poor Mexico, it has been said ever since, so far from God and so close to the United States. After the invasion, the rest of Mexico's mutilated territory suffered from U.S. investments in copper, petroleum, rubber, sugar, banking, and transportation. Far from guiltless in the extermination of the Maya and Yaqui Indians on Yucatan henequen plantations, concentration camps where men, women, children were bought and sold like mules, was the Standard Oil affiliate American Cordage Trust, which bought more than half the henequen and could sell it cheap and at a handsome profit. But sometimes, as Turner discovered, the exploitation of slave labor was direct. A North American administrator bought press-ganged peons in lots of 50 pesos a head. He told Turner, "We always kept them as long as they lasted. In less than 3 months, we buried more than half of them." Mexico's hour of revenge struck in 1910. The country rose in arms against Porfirio Diaz, an agricultural leader, headed the insurrection in the South. He was Manuel Zapata, purest of revolutionaries, most loyal to the cause of the poor, most determined to right the wrongs of society. For agricultural communities throughout Mexico, the last decades of the 19th century have been a period of ruthless pillage. In Morelos, towns and villages were the victims of a bout of land, water, and labor grabbing as sugarcane plantations expanded voraciously. Sugar haciendas dominated the life of the state, and their prosperity had brought with it modern mills, big distilleries, and railroad spurs. In Anensueloco, where Zapata lived and to which he belonged body and soul, the plundered peasants claimed the soil they had worked for 7 continuous centuries. They were there before Cortez arrived, but those who spoke up were marched off to forced labor in Yucatan. Throughout their state, whose good land belonged to 17 families, they lived considerably worse than the polo ponies, the latifundious, pampered in luxurious stables. A law in 1909 providing further seizure of land from its legitimate owners was the last straw. Zapata, taciturn but famous as the state's best horsebreaker and respected by all for his honesty and courage, turned guerrillero. The men of the South quickly formed a liberating army. Diaz fell and the revolution swept Francisco Indalecio Madero into power. Promises of agrarian reform soon disappeared in a fog of institutionalism. On his wedding day, Zapata had to interrupt the party. The government had sent General Victoriano Huerta's troops to crush him. According to the learned pundits in the city, the hero had become a bandit. In November 1911, Zapata proclaimed the Plan de Ayala and wrote, "I am resolved to struggle against everything and everybody." The plan noted that the overwhelming majority of Mexican communities and citizens are owners of no more than the land they walk on, and proposed that the property of enemies of the revolution be nationalized, that lands usurped by the latifundista avalanche be returned to their legal owners, and that a third of the remaining haciendados' lands be expropriated. The Plan de Ayala became a magnet, drawing thousands upon thousands of peasants into Zapata's ranks. Zapata denounced the infamous pretension of reducing everything to a mere change of men in government. The revolution was not being made for that. The struggle went on for nearly 10 years against Diaz, against Madero, against Huerta the assassin, and later against Venustiano Carranza. The long war years were also years of continual U.S. intervention. The Marines staged 2 landings and several bombardments. Diplomatic agents framed a variety of political plots, and Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson successfully organized the murder of President Madero and his vice president. The successive shifts of power did not dilute the fury of the attacks against Zapata and his forces, for they were the real danger, the open expression of the class struggle deeply embedded in the national revolution. Governments and newspapers clamored against the vandal hordes of the general from Morelos. Powerful armies were sent one after the other against him. Fire, massacre, and the devastation of villages proved equally futile. Men, women, and children were shot or hanged as Zapatista spies. The proclamations of victory following the butcheries, the cleanup had succeeded, but in nomadic revolutionaries' mountain camps in the south, bonfires soon blazed up again. More than once, Zapata's forces counterattacked successfully up to the suburbs of the capital. After the fall of Huerta's regime, Zapata and Pancho Villa, the Attila of the south and the Centaur of the north, entered Mexico City as conquerors and arranged a temporary division of power. At the end of 1914, a brief period of peace enabled Zapata to put into force in Morelos an agrarian reform even more radical than that outlined in the Plan de Ayala. The founder of the Socialist Party and some anarcho-syndicalist militants considerably influenced this process. They radicalized the leader's ideology without weakening his traditional roots and afforded him indispensable organizational know-how. The agrarian reform proposed to destroy at the roots and forever the unjust monopoly of land in order to realize a social state which guarantees fully the natural right which every man has to an extension of land necessary for his own subsistence and that of his family. Lands taken from communities and individuals since the de-amortization law of 1856 were restored. Maximum limits were laid down for holding sizes according to climate and fertility, and the lands of enemies of the revolution were declared national property. This last political decision had, as in Ortega's agrarian reform, a clear economic meaning. The latifundistas were the enemy. Technical schools, tool factories, and the rural credit bank were established. Sugar mills and distilleries were nationalized and became public services. A system of local democracy put the reins of political power and of economic maintenance in the people's hands. Zapatista schools sprouted and spread. Popular juntas were organized for defense and the promotion of revolutionary principles, and an authentic democracy took shape and gained in strength. The municipalities were nuclear units of government, and the people elected their leaders, courts, and police. Military leaders had to submit to the wishes of organized civilian communities. Bureaucrats and generals no longer imposed methods of production and of living. The revolution tied itself to tradition and functioned in conformity with the customs and usage of each pueblo. That is, if a certain pueblo wants the communal system, so it will be executed, and if another pueblo wants the division of land in order to admit small property, so it will be done.